how I managed to free myself from my own mother's manipulation. I never thought I'd say this in public, but today I feel the need to get it out. Not because I'm over it all, because it still hurts, but because I've finally started breathing. It all started on a seemingly ordinary Christmas night, but it ended up becoming a turning point in my life. I'd endured humiliation, criticism, and manipulation from my mother my entire life. Since I was a child, she molded me into the perfect daughter, in her mind, which was actually just an extension of her desires. But that night, she crossed all limits. It was the day I realized that if I continued like that, I would end up losing myself forever. Christmas at my mother's house was always an obligation, never a celebration. This year, I'd gone with Jorge because I thought that with him there, maybe she'd control herself. I was sorely mistaken. From the moment we arrived, she'd made a point of poking me with indirect comments about my life, my body, my way of speaking. Helena, my sister, chimed in, repeating everything my mother had said about me being ungrateful, rebellious, and rude. I tried to swallow it to keep my cool, but I could already feel that knot in my stomach that always appeared at these gatherings. Jorge held my hand, but I already knew the storm was coming. The situation got out of hand when my mother started saying, in front of everyone, that my relationship wouldn't last because no man can stand a disobedient woman. I had already learned to ignore this kind of attack, but when she turned around and started bad-mouthing my career, saying I was high on myself for having achieved a position she never wanted me to have, it was too much. I tried to respond calmly, but she escalated her tone. Helena stood up and started calling me selfish, that I only thought of myself. I felt like I was surrounded. My breath became short. I knew if I didn't react, I would end up falling apart right then and there. I got up from the table to try to leave, but my mother followed, yelling in my ear. Jorge tried to intervene, but she told him to shut up. When I said I wasn't going to listen to that anymore, she pushed me. It wasn't a light push. I tripped and hit my arm on the corner of the wall. The shock was so great that I was instantly paralyzed. It wasn't just psychological anymore. It was physical. I heard some relatives urging me to calm down, but no one really did anything to stop it. And the worst was seeing Helena standing there, looking at me as if I had deserved it. There, I felt like I no longer had a family. Anger made me run. Jorge followed, but I was in a trance. I grabbed my bag and headed out the door. The street air hit my face and I started to shake. I don't know if it was from the cold or the adrenaline. Jorge hugged me and said, "It's over, Rosanna. You don't have to go back there ever again." In that moment, those words sank in like a truth I'd been avoiding. I didn't need to anymore. I shouldn't anymore. It was time to accept that I wasn't going to change, that my mother would always want to control me, and that if I kept trying to please her, she would destroy me. We went straight to Jorge's house. I sat on the couch and stared into space. He made me tea, but I couldn't drink it. I just thought about my entire life up until that point. How many times I'd held back tears to avoid causing trouble. How many times I'd stopped doing what I wanted to do to avoid her. Attack. How many times I'd been told I wasn't good enough, that I should be like Helena. And all for what? To get to the point where she physically assaulted me in the middle of a party and no one stood up to defend me. It was that morning that I decided I was going to cut it off. Not just take a break, as I had done before. I was going to truly cut it off. No visits, no calls, no messages, and also no longer allowing her to continue talking about me with impunity. I knew it would hurt. I knew it would be difficult because, toxic as she was my mother. But I also knew that if I wanted peace, I would have to create a wall between my life and hers. And that wall needed to be insurmountable. In the following days, the attempts to contact me came. First, hysterical phone calls, alternating between crying and screaming. Then, guilt-ridden messages, telling me I was destroying the family. Helena sent me audio messages repeating the same speech, trying to make me feel like I was in the wrong. I didn't respond to any of them. I deleted everything without listening to the end. Only Jorge knew what was happening, and he reminded me every day that I had the right to protect myself, that I didn't need to justify anything to anyone. But then came a different kind of attack, the lies. I discovered that my mother had started telling relatives and even acquaintances that Jorge had alienated me, that he was controlling, that I was dominated by him. She also made up stories about me having problems at work and that I was going to be fired. This really started to hurt me, because people in my professional circle heard these stories and started looking at me askance. That's when I realized that simply cutting off contact wasn't going to be enough. I would have to defend myself. Jorge introduced me to Jacqueline, his sister. She's a lawyer and had handled similar cases before. When I told her everything, she wasn't shocked. She said this kind of family. Manipulation was more common than I imagined, but that what my mother was doing could be classified as defamation and harassment. She explained the legal steps I could take, and it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I had the chance to turn the tables. It was strange to start gathering evidence against my own mother, saving screenshots, recording audio, recording incidents. Each file I saved felt like a weight on my conscience. At the same time, each time I organized the folders, I felt like I was strengthening a shield. Jacqueline said it wasn't about revenge, it was about self-preservation, and I understood she was right. I didn't want to hurt my mother, but she couldn't keep hurting me with impunity. The hardest part was dealing with Helena. She kept defending my mother, saying I was overreacting, that a mother is a mother, and that I would regret it. One day, she came to my house unannounced. Jorge wouldn't let her in. I stood behind the door, listening to her cry and tell her I was destroying everything. And I cried too, but with relief, because I realized that for the first time I was choosing myself, even if it meant disappointing the ones I loved. Over time, the calls and messages diminished, but the stories my mother made up still surfaced from time to time, from people I never imagined would ever come into contact with her. Each time I heard something new, it hurt, but I learned not to react impulsively. I sent everything to Jacqueline, who began to build the case. She told me that, when the time came, we would have everything we needed to take legal action if necessary. The most surprising thing was seeing Jorge by my side every step of the way. He never tried to make decisions for me, but always reinforced that my decisions were valid. When I started to doubt, he reminded me of everything I'd been through. He didn't just hold my hand that Christmas night, he's continued to hold it ever since. And that gave me strength I didn't even know I had. I realized that true love doesn't suffocate, doesn't demand, doesn't manipulate. True love supports and respects. The turning point began with that push, but the real transformation was realizing I no longer had to prove anything to my mother, or to Helena. I wasn't ungrateful, I wasn't rebellious, I wasn't less for not following the script she wanted for me. I was a woman who had the right to choose her own life, and that day, in Jorge's living room, with my arm aching and my heart in pieces, I finally accepted that freeing myself from her was the only way to save myself. The first few months after cutting were like a detox. At first, it felt like I was weaning myself off a drug I was addicted to, but which hurt me every day. I missed, not my real mother, but the idea of family I longed for, but never had. It was a strange mix of relief and grief. I cried alone in the shower, but at the same time, I slept better knowing I wouldn't wake up to messages of accusations or humiliation. Helena remained distant, and it hurt. As much as she had been part of the manipulation, she was my sister. I still hoped that one day she would see things the way I did, but I learned not to waste my energy trying to open her eyes. I hadn't been able to change my mother in 30 years, and I wasn't going to be able to change my sister overnight. If she ever wanted to break out of that cycle, the door would be open. But in the meantime, I needed to focus on myself. Work was one of the hardest hit. The gossip my mother spread reached my boss. I had to have a frank conversation with him, explaining that there was a family issue that was fueling lies about me. It was humiliating to expose something so personal, but it was necessary. Fortunately, he believed me and supported me. That showed me that no matter how hard my mother tried, I could still protect my reputation with the truth. Jacqueline was essential. She not only handled the legal side of things, but also gave me advice on how to deal with it emotionally. One day, she told me, "You need to understand that what your mother does doesn't define who you are. She shouts about you to the world, but you're the one living your life, not her." I'd never thought of it that way. It was simple, but it made me realize that I was living as if my mother had more power than she actually did. We began the formal process of reporting the incidents. Every offensive call, every message, every rumor confirmed. I had to relearn to see these things as evidence and not as personal attacks that destroyed me. It was a daily practice to no longer internalize her words. When I could look at a lie and think, "This will go to court," instead of, "This will destroy me," I realized I was gaining strength. At the same time, I started therapy. It was the best decision I ever made. I thought I knew all the wounds my mother had left, but I discovered there were many I didn't even know existed. I had beliefs about myself that came from her, like the idea that I needed to constantly prove myself or that love always came with pain. In therapy, I began to dismantle these beliefs and rebuild my self-image. Jorge was patient throughout this process. He understood that sometimes I had emotional setbacks, moments when I considered calling my mom just to try again. He didn't judge me, just reminded me of everything I'd achieved since I left. His patience showed me that being with someone healthy is completely different from living in constant fear of being punished. The first Christmas after the cut was strange. We went on a trip, just the two of us. I didn't have to think about choosing clothes to avoid provoking criticism, nor did I have to emotionally prepare myself to endure jokes and humiliations. It was just me and him, no yelling, no heavy atmosphere. At first, it felt like something was missing, but then I realized it was just the silence, and that this silence was peace. Helena texted me on New Year's. She didn't apologize, but she said she missed me. I replied that I missed her too, but that we could only meet in a respectful environment without attacks. She never responded. It hurt, but it was easier to accept than before, because now I knew my limits were non-negotiable. Over time, the case against my mother began to take shape. Jacqueline said that, if necessary, we could file a lawsuit for defamation and harassment. Just knowing I had this support gave me peace of mind. I didn't want to fight forever, but I wanted her to know that I was no longer that daughter who silently accepted everything. The greatest victory, however, wasn't legal or professional. It was personal. One day, I looked in the mirror and realized I no longer felt small. I no longer had that voice in my head telling me I wasn't enough. I was making my own decisions without thinking about what she would say. This may seem simple to many, but for me, it was revolutionary. There are still hard days. There are still moments when I miss her and think about what could have been if my mother were different. But now I know that these thoughts are part of life and that I don't have to act on them. I can miss her and still choose my freedom. The process of rebuilding myself is ongoing. It's not as if I woke up one day cured. It's one step at a time, one limit maintained, one relapse avoided, one internal victory celebrated. Every time I say no to something that would make me go back, I feel like I'm honoring the woman I chose to be. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that cutting ties with someone who destroys you isn't a lack of love. It's actually an act of self-love. And self-love is what keeps me going. If I had stayed, I probably would have lost myself already. I left hurt, but whole enough to rebuild. Today, as I write this, I know my story is still being written. I don't know if I'll ever have a healthy relationship with my mother, or if Helena will be able to break free. But I know I managed to break the chains that held me back. And if I could, anyone reading this who feels trapped can too. It won't be easy. It will hurt. But it's worth every second of peace that comes afterward.